It is absolutely essential this week that we recognize that the week marks the 10th anniversary of the Obergefell decision handed down by the U.S. Supreme Court in 2015, a 5-4 decision that required all states to recognize same-sex marriage. It is hard to describe what that landmark decision has meant for the moral revolution in the United States. That moral revolution has ridden largely on the momentum gained by certain Supreme Court decisions. And you could just think of the decisions of the late 1960s, early 1970s, Roe v. Wade in particular. And you could go to other decisions as well on sexuality issues, gender issues, marriage issues. But Obergefell is a very clear line in the sand. There's before Obergefell and after Obergefell. That 5-4 decision was devastating. The majority opinion was written by Justice Anthony Kennedy. And like Roe, in so many ways, it was an example of horrifying constitutional argument. And as a matter of fact, in some ways, it really wasn't even a constitutional argument. It was something of an existential argument in which, writing for the majority, Justice Kennedy basically treated marriage as two things, essentially two things, a social institution and a therapeutic context. And he basically said that as a social institution with certain legal rights and as a therapeutic construct, individuals ought to be able just to marry whoever they want to marry. If it's a man and a man or a woman and a woman, he said basically that's just the extension of the notion of liberty. Now, as we noted at the time, this continues a line of jurisprudence going back especially to the 1960s, going all the way back to decisions on contraceptive issues, in which you just had the invention of a new set of rights. And over time, of course, this just expands in which you have the claim that there's an interior self that now deserves to be fully respected as fully autonomous, and if that self wants to join with any other self for certain social benefits, no other self and no government should be able to say no. But I just want to say that it was an atrocious argument, but it's the kind of atrocious argument that has won so many times at the U.S. Supreme Court. It is an illegitimate form of constitutional interpretation. It is following in a trajectory of other very bad Supreme Court decisions, and like them, here's the most important thing, it came with inevitable effects. And so one of the things the moral revolutionaries have counted on, and by the way, they acknowledged this early on. So for example, some of the theorists in the LGBTQ movement, some of the activists early on, were very clear that there's no way they could win, certainly nationwide at the legislative level. They would have to win in the courts. And so what they couldn't get through the political process itself, they went around to the courts. And, the courts were unusually cooperative in this respect. You could say they were unusually vulnerable, but it is because they had abandoned a legitimate constitutional hermeneutic, a way of interpreting the Constitution, and basically were turning the court into a sociological engine of what they saw as inevitable progress. The decision was atrocious, and I don't have time today, but I would love to just read from the dissent offered by Justice Antonin Scalia at the time. But I want to point out that it has changed public opinion. It did lead to a before and after. That bright line in the pavement, as I say, it is a bright line. And on one side of it, you have the right of states to define marriage in accordance with the way marriage has been defined throughout virtually all of human history. And on the other side of that line, you have the Supreme Court saying that states do not have the right to define marriage. And instead, marriage has to include a man and a man or a woman and a woman. And of course, by the way, that sets that up. If the issue is marriage is simply a social institution and personal autonomy and a therapeutic construct is the only real question, then how do you say it's just one and one? How do you say just two? Obviously, this sets the stage for further subversion of the entire moral system, indeed of creation order in the universe. But it is interesting to see that you have basically a realignment in the United States. The vast majority of Americans 18 to 20 years ago were against same-sex marriage. Within a 2-year period after Obergefell, the vast majority of Americans, by almost the same numbers, were saying they were now for same-sex marriage. And what makes that interesting is that just chronologically, this meant many of the same people in the public. Their minds had changed. Now, in all likelihood, their minds hadn't been very firmly set. But the point is that the Supreme Court, in a decision like this, The left always hopes it has a vast moral impact, and conservatives always fear it will have a vast moral impact. And in this case, the liberal hopes and the conservative fears have been fully realized. Now, as evidence of this, you have a piece by Kristen Soltis Anderson, identified as a Republican pollster. It appeared in the New York Times. The headline is, "Roll Back Legal Same-Sex Marriage. Republicans are getting it wrong." In other words, she's saying it's a losing strategy to go back and try to defend marriage as the union of a man and a woman. Society's moved on. The numbers are the big story. This is a losing argument. It's also interesting that the Southern Baptist Convention, meeting just a few weeks ago in Dallas, made headlines for a resolution calling for the reversal of the Obergefell decision. Now, that's treated as something new, and as a resolution, it was new, but as a matter of moral resolve, that goes all the way back to when Obergefell was handed down. A call by something like the SBC to reverse Obergefell would have made no news 10 years ago. I don't think it would have made news 8 or 9 years ago, but now 10 years later, we just need to recognize that so much of the culture has now realigned around this Supreme Court decision that even coming out in dissent of same-sex marriage is treated as something akin to cultural treason. But I just want to underline the fact that Christians have absolutely no option. You might have politicians who can change their position on this. You might have academics who will change their arguments on this. You might have a Supreme Court that claims to have the authority to redefine marriage. But for Christians bound to Scripture and to creation order, we have nowhere to go. And so Obergefell is a lamentable development, predictable as it was, and it came with all of the negative effects that were predicted, every one of them basically very much in place right now and in full evidence in the society. And this also underlines the fact that there were major intellectuals like Daniel Patrick Moynihan, former Democratic U.S. Senator, who made the argument that politics is downstream from culture. But I think we also have to recognize as Christians that the culture is downstream from certain developments, such as this Supreme Court decision. This just facilitated an awful lot of Americans saying, that's just the way things are. I'm going to get on the right side of that bright line. It's also important to say that the recovery from this kind of moral rebellion is not going to be easy. It's not going to come fast. Roe v. Wade wasn't reversed for just about a half century.